So this is the last lecture of the semester. Next week we'll be meeting at normal class time, but in the psych lab, which I just showed you all where that is. And then after that, all we have left is the final. So the final date is on the syllabus. I'll be posting a reminder about when it is later. And just a reminder, the final is cumulative, so there will be 30 questions from the prior chapter, so everything before chapter 7, and then 20 questions from chapter 7, 20 from chapter 11, no written. So today we're covering the final chapter, which is on development. So how people change over time, and we'll be going from conception all the way to old age, although the bulk of the chapter is on child development. And I'll start with the two basic methods that are used in developmental psychology. And those two are cross-sectional and longitudinal. These are the two methods that we use when we are studying how people change over time. Cross-sectional is easier and cheaper, but longitudinal is more valid. So let's say I'm interested in how musical taste changes with age. And I have a hypothesis that as people get older, they prefer slower music. Because their bodies are slower, they don't move as quickly, so they like to get down to slower music. I have no idea if that's true, just made it up, but it's a hypothesis you can test. If I was doing cross-sectional research, here's what I would do. I would get a group of 20-year-olds, group of 30-year-olds, group of 40-year-olds, etc., up to 80-year-olds, and ask each of them what kind of music they like, in terms of speed. Let's suppose I find that the 80-year-olds like slower music and the 20-year-olds like faster music. And I conclude, aging causes people to like slower music. So first of all, that is how cross-sectional studies work. But can anyone point out a problem with that kind of inference? Not subjective. Let me put it another way. So I explained those findings by saying the 80-year-olds like slower music because they're older. Is there an alternative explanation? So the issue is, it could be that it's not due to just aging, but the fact that the 80-year-olds grew up in a different time. So my hypothesis was, it's because they're slower, they age, and that's why they like it, but they also grew up in a different generation that had, in this case, that would have had different music. So I don't know if it's due to the natural process of aging, or if it's because of what generation they grew up in. So the problem with cross-sectional studies is they do not control for cohort effects. Cohort effects meaning effects that have to do with what group you're a part of. In this case, what generation, when you grew up. So longitudinal is better. In longitudinal, you get one group of, in this case, 20-year-olds, and you follow up with them at various points as they age. But it's the same group of 20-year-olds the whole way through. So that's much better. The problem is it takes a lot more time. You have to wait decades for them to age and measure them repeatedly. So typically in a really good longitudinal study, there will be several generations of researchers, right? The first guy or gal might retire or die, so someone has to pass the baton forward. Does that distinction make sense? So cross-sectional, multiple groups of different ages measured at the same time, longitudinal. One group, follow them as they age. Okay, so after that, we'll go on a journey from conception all the way to death. So human development starts at the moment of fertilization. So when a man and woman love each other very much. So the sperm hits the egg. That entity is called a zygote. So a fertilized egg, the fancy term for that is a zygote. And the stage in which the zygote is placed is called the germinal stage. So the first stage is conception to 2 weeks. The zygote travels down, and then eventually it's called a bladocyst. It implants itself, and the cells divide rapidly. So 0 to 2 weeks, first stage. The next stage is 3 to 8 weeks. This is called the embryonic stage. So now the term for the entity is the embryo. This is when the major organs start to develop, and it starts to look sort of, kind of human-like. Towards the end of the embryonic stage, there is sexual differentiation. So the body starts to either be masculinized or feminized. Some may already know this, but the default, I don't know if we've talked about this in this class, but the default of the embryo is to become a female. It's testosterone, which is the release of which is triggered by the Y chromosome, that masculinizes the body. We know this because there's a condition called AIS, androgen insensitivity syndrome, where the entity has XY chromosomes, so male DNA, but their bodies don't process testosterone. And testosterone, remember, is what masculinizes the body, so it goes down the female developmental path. So when the baby's born, looks female, nothing seems wrong. When they grow up, their bodies are very prototypically female, but they just don't get periods. That's the telltale sign that something's off. And then you do a DNA test, turns out XY chromosomes. This is a bit of an aside, but in normal cases, if testosterone is released towards the end of the embryonic stage, the body masculinizes. If not, feminizes. The final stage is the fetal stage, which is 9 weeks to birth, and this is associated with rapid growth of the organs, including rapid brain development. In fact, by the time the baby is born, they essentially have all of the neurons they will ever have. What happens after birth is not so much the growth of new neurons, but the growth of new connections. I mentioned in passing back in chapter 3 that brain development after birth is a matter of growth and pruning of connections. So the brain grows more connections than it needs and loses the ones that don't get used. So those are sort of the biologically pre-programmed stages, but there are ways in which the environment can affect development inside the womb. To be specific, the fetus can be exposed to teratogens, which is a catch-all term for any non-genetic, namely environmental agent that can harm fetal development. So different things that the fetus is exposed to can harm its development. What's an obvious example? Alcohol, exactly. So alcohol is a teratogen most people know about. It could also be the mom gets sick, right? A virus is a potential teratogen, lead in the water. Anything like that can count as a teratogen. But crucially, it has to be non-genetic. If the mom has some or deaf for that matter. If there's some genetic disease that's passed on, that doesn't count as a teratogen. In the case of alcohol, as many of you probably know, there's a term for kids whose development is harmed by alcohol, which is fetal alcohol syndrome, which is associated with various physical and neurological deficits. There's interesting work on this, finding that, so I'm sure you all know what morning sickness is. So women, when they're pregnant, often get sick and become very disgusted by certain foods. There's interesting work showing that the time at which morning sickness is most likely to happen is the time when there's the most brain development going on. And furthermore, that the kinds of foods that are most likely to trigger morning sickness are the ones that are most likely to carry pathogens, like meat, for example. So there's a pretty straightforward evolutionary story to tell there. Although you might ask, why isn't there the same inborn aversion to alcohol? And the answer seems to be alcohol is much more recent. We've only been, making alcohol for a few thousand years, whereas rotting meat goes very far back into our evolutionary past. So, baby's born, and we as psychologists are interested in their behavior and their thinking. Their thinking is harder to get at, but there are some behaviors that you should know about. One thing you should know is the 5 basic reflexes that babies are born with. These are sometimes used to test for normal development. So if some of these reflexes are not in place, that's a potential red flag. So the 5 are the rooting reflex. Rooting meaning if you touch the baby's cheek, the baby will turn towards whatever touched its cheek. So this is obviously to facilitate breastfeeding. There's the sucking reflex. Again, pretty obvious. Whatever you put in the baby's mouth, it instinctively sucks on it. Again, obviously to facilitate breastfeeding. There's the grasping reflex. So anything you put in the baby's hand, it instinctively grabs it. So if you have like a baby sibling or a baby cousin, it's a fun thing to do. Put your finger in its hand, it instinctively grasp it. The 2 other ones have names that are not as intuitive, but I have cute baby videos for each. So you don't have to know the details of the pattern. So for those of you watching the video later, the Moreau reflex is if you drop the baby backwards, the baby will instinctively fling his or her arms out. And the Babinski is if you stroke the baby's foot, they will spread the toes out. So again, if any of those are absent, that's a sign that there's possible developmental problems. So I said in passing that it's hard to know what babies are thinking, but there are some clever indirect ways of getting at it. One simple thing you can look at, pretty soon after the baby's born, is looking time. What do babies prefer to look at? You can measure eye gaze. Here's a simple finding. One of these, babies prefer to look at. Any guesses as to which?
The one on the left.
So your left, so this one. Yes, correct. Why is that? Looks like a face. So this generalizes. Anything that's sort of face-like, babies have a preference for looking at. And that's built in right from the beginning. I won't test you on this, but there are also some interesting studies trying to get at early proto-moral intuitions in babies. So my area of research is moral psychology, and this is, again, an excuse to show a cute set of videos. Not testable, but another clever way that psychologists have of getting at what babies are thinking. Okay, so I mean, if you're watching at home, not that it's testable, but basically babies choose the more helpful puppet in the puppet show. If you watch the rest of the video, they don't just like puppets that are nice to other puppets. They like puppets that are mean to mean puppets. So it's quite a sophisticated proto-morality that kids have. Okay. On the subject of motor development, so kids then start to learn various motor skills, and there are two principles you need to know in relation to motor development. These are about the order in which it tends to happen. The first is the cephalocaudal principle, which means that motor development tends to go from the head down. So they gain some control over moving their head first, and then tends to move down. And the proximodistal principle says that motor development tends to go from the middle towards the outside. So like the upper arms and the upper legs first, and then toward, for example, and then towards the outside. The book then has the kind of normal order of motor skill acquisition. I'm not going to ask you to memorize the details. There's lots of variability anyways. I happen to know that I was wrong in terms of what order I developed in. Apparently I was so fat that my little arms couldn't push my body up, so I could stand before I could crawl, which is wrong apparently, but at least that's what my parents said. Maybe they're messing with me, but according to my parents, I was an exception. One early motor error that kids make, or I guess really it's a perceptual error, but is something that the book calls scale errors. So they have limited appreciation for relative size. There's some funny pictures of like kids trying to sit in toy cars that are much too small, or go down like slides for their toy Barbie or that kind of thing. Okay. Next, we'll be spending a good amount of time on the work of Jean Piaget. So Piaget is probably the most influential developmental psychologist, I guess other than Freud, but he's, I guess, the most influential non-crazy developmental psychologist. So a lot of people poke fun at Freud. Even though Piaget has his critics, I don't think anyone thinks he's crazy. There's definitely a lot of insight that Piaget had. So Piaget conceptualized development as happening in 4 basic stages, and those stages are nudge, nudge, hint, hint. Very easy to write questions about. But before talking about those, I want to talk about his basic mechanisms. So Piaget thought that kids, throughout development, were basically little scientists. They form their sort of proto-hypotheses about how the world works and test them in various ways. Now this comes to its full fruition in the final stage when kids can really think like scientists in terms of logic and abstractions. But even early on, kids are sort of proto-scientists. And there are 3 basic cognitive mechanisms that Piaget posited. One is schema creation. Another is assimilation. And another is accommodation. Schema in psychology is basically a fancy term for a concept. that someone has in their head. That's typically how it's used, although Piaget actually defines it more broadly as any pattern of thought or behavior. So, for example, like the instinct to grab something technically counts as a schema for Piaget, because he defines it very broadly. So kids throughout development are creating new concepts and new behavior patterns and testing out how they work and modifying them in different ways. When the kid encounters a new thing, there are two things that can do with that. Assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is where you add the new thing to an existing schema. So let's say the kid has learned or created the schema for dog, so they have the concept of dog in their head, and they see a German Shepherd for the first time, and they say, Mommy, what's that? And Mom says, that's a dog. The kid goes, okay, that makes sense. You add the German Shepherd to dog. It's an easy fit. Accommodation is basically the same thing, but with the added part that you have to change the schema in order for it to accept the new thing. Or if you like, you have to change the schema so it can accommodate the new thing. So let's say the kid has the schema dog, and it sees a new thing, but it's not a German Shepherd, it's like a Chihuahua, or some really weird dog that it's not a very prototypical dog. The kid says, Mommy, what's that? And Mom says, that's a dog. The kid goes, huh. Okay. And the kid kind of has to adjust. He has to kind of expand his sense of what a dog is in order for it to fit the Chihuahua. So that's just a simple case, and Piaget thought these three processes together were basically how the kids learn and develop cognitively. So these three make sense. Okay, now we'll talk about the 4 stages, which, as I say, are very testable. So, actually, I'll write them out first. I may erase them after, but they are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. If you want to memorize the order, you should think of concrete operational as the middle one and use that to help you remember. So concrete operational is one stage. Pre means before, so pre-operational comes before that. And formal operational basically means fancy operational. So that's the most advanced stage. I may erase these to make room for the next stuff, but so sensory motor, the first one. So if you look at the root words, sensory and motor, at this stage, kids' schemas are very simple behavior patterns. They don't yet really have language. So when they're exploring the world, they're doing so basically by looking at it and physically interacting with it. Playing with stuff, putting it in their mouth, stuff like that. So during this stage, there's a concept that Piaget thought developed in the middle, which is object permanence. I should say, the sensory motor stage is about 0 to 2. So Piaget thought that kids at the beginning of this stage did not have object permanence. Object permanence is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when you can't see them. So, I have the felt, I put it behind my back, and none of you think, wow, it's gone. But Piaget thought in the early parts of the sensory motor stage, that's basically what kids thought. A Piagetian psychologist, that's how they would explain something like peekaboo. Why is peekaboo so surprising and funny to kids? It's because, well, the face disappears and then comes back. I mentioned in passing that no one thinks Piaget was crazy, but this is one area where some subsequent work has cast doubt on Piaget. There's a lot of work into, so I should say, he thought this developed around 8 months, so around the middle of the stage. There's some work now indicating that kids have a pretty good intuitive sense of the physical world earlier than that. One thing you can do is look at what kinds of things kids find surprising. So, if you show them a scene over and over again, like someone letting go of a ball and it falls down, they get bored. Let go of the ball and it falls up, they look longer, they're more surprised by that. So there's studies like that many have interpreted as showing that kids have a good sense of the physical world earlier than Piaget thought, but for whatever it's worth, Piaget thought this developed in the middle. So the next stage is the pre-operational stage. And during this stage, the beginning is marked by the fact that kids start to speak more. They start to be able to represent the world not just by looking at it and playing with it, but speaking about it, and therefore thinking about it somewhat more abstractly. But there are some limitations. One key limitation in the early part of the pre-operational stage is egocentrism. This term is going to come later in adolescence, and it's going to mean something somewhat different there. In this context, egocentrism doesn't mean that you think you're amazing or something like that. It means you're unable to see the world through other people's eyes. Put another way, you don't have what psychologists call theory of mind. Theory of mind is the understanding that other people have different minds from you. So I have a mind most of the time. I have thoughts and beliefs and desires, and I know that you all have different beliefs and desires than me. But kids have difficulty understanding that. So here, I'm just going to erase these to make room. Here's a classic way of testing that. So let's say there's a box of Smarties, or there's a box labeled Smarties, and here's Billy. You show Billy the box of Smarties, and you say, Billy, what do you think is inside that box? And Billy says, Smarties. No surprise. You open the box, and there's pens. And Billy says, you tricked me. And then you bring in a different kid, Bob, and you say, Billy, what do you think Bob thinks is in the box? Now, Bob hasn't seen the pens reveal, so Billy should say Smarties. That's what Bob will think is in the box. But Billy says pens. Again, this is indicating no theory of mind. He can't understand that, okay, I know there's pens in there, but Bob doesn't know that. So that's what's meant by egocentrism, or no theory of mind. Now, that typically goes away around ages 3 to 4. So sometime in the middle of the pre-operational stage, kids do develop theory of mind. Unless they're suffering from developmental issues like autism. One early sign of autism is difficulty with theory of mind tests. Okay, I want to be very careful so as not to mislead you. So object permanence and theory of mind are things that develop in the middle of these two stages. So pre-operational, I should add, this one is about 2 to 7, give or take. The next concept I'm going to talk about is like a border. Once you understand the next concept, which is conservation, this is like the graduating test. Once you understand this, then you graduate into the concrete operational stage. So the concrete operational stage is partly defined by an ability to understand this. So the test I'm going to show you, if you have siblings or cousins around 6 to 8, try them out. See if they've passed. So what is conservation? Conservation is the understanding that amount stays the same even if shape or distribution changes. So here's a classic example. So you show a kid, let's say he's like 5, so he's definitely pre-operational. You show him 2 wide glasses with the same amount of water. The glasses are the same shape, so they have the same amount. You show the kid the 2 glasses, which one has more water? The kid will go, they have the same. Okay, good. You take one and you pour it into a tall, skinny glass, so the water's higher up. And you do this right in front of the kid. You show him both glasses, which one has more water, and the kid will point to the tall, skinny glass. Now, that's really stupid. Like, that's not how it works. But what that shows is a failure to understand conservation. I'm not actually judging. Of course, I would have failed such tests too. So there's lots of different ways of getting at this. This is one of my favorite videos. I have a video of a kid failing several conservation tests. So this would be someone who's still in the pre-operational stage. Once he passes these tests, then he'd be considered to be in the concrete operational stage. Don't you all feel so much smarter now? Okay. Okay, so again, just to repeat the definition, which should make sense now, conservation means amount stays the same, even if shape or distribution changes. So once the kids understand that, they move into the concrete operational, which is about 8 to 12. So this one was about 2 to 7. And then the last stage is formal operational, which is 12 plus. So from around puberty onwards, the kids are in the formal operational. This is when the kids can most fully think like scientists. So they sort of fully realize their potential for more abstract thinking. In particular, they become capable of what's called hypothetico-deductive thinking. So hypothetico mean having to do with hypotheses or hypothetical states of affairs. So what the kid can do is make hypotheses, like this might be true. If that was true, what would follow from that? And then test what follows from that. Okay, any questions about Piaget's stages? I mentioned theory of mind in connection with the pre-operational stage, which again develops in the middle. One early sign of theory of mind is lying. Because when you think about it, if you have no theory of mind, it doesn't make much sense to lie. You can only lie if you understand that I know some things that you don't know, and I can use that to my advantage. Though, of course, you shouldn't do that. But if the kid starts lying, the bad news is your kid's lying, but the good news is he's developed theory of mind. So, Piaget, as I've already said, uncovered some real patterns, but there are some lines of criticism. One that I've already mentioned is that many now argue that Piaget underestimated the abilities of infants. It's now widely thought that kids show a good intuitive understanding of the physical world earlier than Piaget thought. Many also argue that Piaget underestimated the amount of variability between kids. So he has these nice, neat stages, but empirical research reveals that there's a lot of variability in terms of, for example, when kids reach these different milestones. And lastly, it's widely thought that Piaget underestimated the role of culture. So he viewed these stages as sort of a universal developmental trajectory that's part of human nature, but if you grow up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, probably you never reach what he calls formal operational, just because if you don't have a scientific education or a modern education, you're not trained to think in those sorts of ways. Just as, if there was not that there would be, if there was a psychologist in Papua New Guinea, they'd probably say that the final stage is learning how to hunt and gather. And then they'd say, those Canadians, they never reach the final developmental stage. So that's one final criticism. Another psychologist who worked on cognitive development is Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist, I believe during the Soviet era. And he emphasized the role that one's peers and one's culture plays in development. So let's say this is developmental progression. So as you move up, that means you've acquired more skills. So let's say this is, 25 or something. And let's say the kid's here. So everything under this line is tasks that the kid can do by his or herself. So the kid knows X number of words, X number of, can play X number of games, whatever, all the different skills that he or she has acquired. Right above that is the zone of tasks that the kid can do, but only with help. So, for example, let's say the kid is able to solve puzzles with 50 pieces or less by him or herself. But if it's got 75 to 100 pieces, they can solve it, but only if a big brother or a parent helps or something like that. That region, Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. So this just means the types of tasks and skills that the kid can only successfully do if he or she has help. Vygotsky used a spatial metaphor for this called scaffolds. I don't know if that's in the key terms or not, but scaffolds is just his term for other people helping you move up through a zone of proximal development. As I say, Vygotsky also more than Piaget, emphasized the role of culture, in particular cultural tools. And by tools, I don't mean like axes or stuff. I mean thinking tools. Tools that are given to you through learning and imitation. So things like language and counting systems count as cultural tools. And some tools are more effective than others. So one example is different counting systems. Many cultures, including like hunter-gatherer type cultures, have only a few words for number. They'll have like 1, 2, and many. So if that's all you have, there's less. You're less able to keep track of things if those are the kinds of tools you have. In Europe, they used to use Roman numerals, which are very poor thinking tools if you want to do mathematics. If you want to have fun. If you want to not have fun, go home and try doing like long multiplication with Roman numerals. Very not fun. So then we stole Arabic numerals, which are much more efficient for doing mathematics. And even there, it can be better than what we do in English. So in English, we have lots of goofy exceptions that make it harder to learn how to count and do math, like 11 and 12. In Mandarin Chinese, I don't know the actual words, but it's the equivalent of 10-1, 10-2, and so on. There's like a simple set of rules that make it easier to learn mathematics. There's some other work not done by Vygotsky, but although before I erase this, any questions on Vygotsky? Only a few terms with him. But there's some other work on particular features of human nature and human behavior that make us very ripe for learning things from other people. One early one is joint attention. So kids from a very young age, like only a few months old, if an adult looks somewhere, the kids look there too, just instinctively. As the kids grow a little bit, say closer to 9 months, this gets a bit more sophisticated. They will look where someone else is looking, but only if their eyes are open. If the adult closes their eyes, they don't engage in joint attention. Humans also engage in imitation, so we copy the behavior of people around us. Now that's not unique to humans. Other primates do that too. But we do something they don't, which is over-imitation. We will copy the behavior of others, even if we can tell it's not doing anything. And whereas chimps don't do that. And as an illustration, I have a video. Okay. So that's over-imitation. The last one in this section is social referencing. This means that before a kid does something, they will look at someone else to see if they have approval or not. So if a kid's going to do some new behavior, it'll look to mom to see if she's freaking out. Okay. The next section is on different ideas related to attachment. So how kids bond with, how kids bond with their caregivers, especially their parents. So some of the early work here was done with animals. The biologist Konrad Lorenz did work on what's called imprinting. So some species are born hypersensitive to cues for attachment. So baby geese basically, whatever moving thing they see the most of for the first few days, they get imprinted and think, that's my mother. Now, this works because in normal cases, the moving thing they see the most of in the first few days is their mother. But in the case of Lorenz's experiment, it was him. So even when the geese grew up, the geese would still follow him around if he called them. So there's some footage of these geese who were imprinted following him around. So that's very cute. But as I mentioned to my Tuesday class, the cuteness is somewhat ruined by the fact that he was a Nazi. And I don't mean like, oh, you're a Nazi. I mean like he was a member of the Nazi party. So that's too bad. Sorry. So that's one. Now another one that I forgot to show on Tuesday, I'll have to post an announcement to my Tuesday class, is work done by Harry Harlow. And this is on the importance of contact comfort. So Harlow gave, first of all, he took baby monkeys away from their mothers. That's kind of sad. And he gave them two surrogate mothers, so two fake mothers. One is this cold metal thing with a milk bottle. The other is this soft, cuddly one with like a soft, furry texture. And the question is, which one would the monkey spend more time with? If you're a naive sort of behaviorist, you might think the milk one. Because just, attachment's just about reinforcement, getting the food or whatever. But in point of fact, as you can see in the picture, they clung to the cuddly one. They would just run over to the milk one for food, and then come back to the cuddly one. So that points to the importance of physical touch for bonding and attachment. Now, what about humans? So we don't have anything quite as dramatic as the geese for Lorenz. It's not as if whatever you see for the first 2 days, boom, that's your mother. But there is important work done on attachment early in life. One of the most important people in this area is Mary Ainsworth, who developed a test for determining what kind of attachment style a kid has. So this is called the strange situation, and it works like this. The mother brings the kid into a new environment with toys. The kid, once it's comfortable, will explore the environment. A new person comes in, and the mother leaves. The mother leaves for like a minute or so, and then comes back. And there are two things that determine which kind of attachment style the kid is labeled as. How does the baby respond when the mother leaves? And how does the baby respond when she comes back? So before going through all of them, I'll show some footage of an example. So the footage I'm going to show is of a securely attached kid. So this is the healthy attachment style. Okay, so as I say, that's an example of secure attachment. So 2 criteria. Is the baby sad when the mother leaves? And is the baby happy when the mother comes back? Babies that are securely attached are sad when the mom leaves and are comforted when she comes back. Here, I'll make sure I go in the same order as the book. Ambivalent kids are very sad when the mom leaves and are not comforted when she comes back. So they're sort of angry, like, how could you abandon me? So maybe more clingy attachment, you could say. All the other types are classified as one or another version of insecure attachment. Then there's avoidant attachment. These kids don't give a shit when the mom leaves and don't give a shit when she comes back. So they could take it or leave it. So that's avoidant. And then the last one, and don't push me for details here, but disorganized means inconsistent in both cases. So that's for kids. There's a similar taxonomy for adults that I'll talk about in a bit. So there's still 4, and they roughly correspond to these 4 with kids, but that's how the 4 are defined with young kids. Any questions about those 4? Okay, another related term is temperament. So you can think of temperament as like baby personality. Babies don't have like, you wouldn't say a baby is, I don't know, conscientious or something. Like that's too sophisticated, but they have emotional patterns, right? Different emotional tendencies that are basically there right from the beginning. My mom always used to say, don't write the parenting book until you've had more than one kid. Once you have more than one kid, you're like, they start out different. And what worked for the first kid may not work for the second kid. Well, I forgot to say, just in passing, secure attachment for kids is also the most common, which I guess is good. Relatedly, the most common temperament is the so-called easy temperament. Kids with an easy temperament are calm, compliant, sleep well, etc. But easy here means, I guess you could think easy on the mother. This is kind of a savage term, but the other type of temperament is difficult temperament. As the term implies, emotionally unstable, irritable, and they don't adjust well to new situations. I don't know if I should say this, but I'm told by my mother that I was an easy baby, and my brother Daniel was a very difficult baby. So even early on, you can tell the difference. I don't think I show it in this class, but in 1200, I show a video of him screaming during playing video games. He's very type A.
It was more Smash Bros. Right?
Yeah. Oh, I think you're in 1200 too. So that brother, apparently from the get-go, he feels the full range of emotion. Let's put it like that. And then the last one is slow to warm up, where the kids start off somewhat difficult, but move towards being easy. So slow to warm up kids are somewhat in the middle. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the taxonomy of attachment style for adults. So here, it's defined again with 2 things, but it's not whether you cry when your mom leaves. But if you're an adult and you cry when your mom leaves, you probably have some other problems, but in youth, it's healthy. The 2 things are attachment avoidance and attachment anxiety. So avoidance goes from high to low, and attachment anxiety also goes from high to low. So what do I mean by these? So avoidance is about whether you avoid being close to people. So if you're high in avoidance, you don't get close to people in your adult relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or what have you. And then anxiety is about how worried you are about the status of your relationships. Are you constantly worried about getting rejected, or about what your friends think of you, or stuff like that? And you can again be high or low. So we locate the 4 attachment styles like that. So secure, here it has the same name as the kid version, is low in both. So you're low in avoidance, which means you do get close to people. And you're low in anxiety, which means you're not constantly worrying about it. Preoccupied, which is similar to ambivalent in the kid case. These people are low in avoidance, so they're still close to people, but they're highly worried about it. So clingy and worried about rejection or negative evaluation and stuff like that. There's fearful, which is the worst. This is high in both. So they're highly worried about what people think about them, and they're so worried that they withdraw. They don't get close to people. And then last one is dismissive, which is similar to avoidant in the kids' case. So they're high avoidance, so they don't get close to people, but this seems to not bother them. So more self-reliant. So low in anxiety, they're not constantly worrying about evaluation. At least so they claim. There's actually some work showing that dismissive avoidant or a dismissive attachment style may sometimes be a kind of defense mechanism, but that's maybe more advanced. Does the basic taxonomy make sense? Any questions about those four? So, is there a continuity here? People in attachment research generally say yes, and they explain it in terms of an internal working model. The idea is kids early on develop you could call it a model or a theory about what people tend to be like. So actually, the early attachment people like Bowlby and Ainsworth were actually strongly influenced by Freud. So Freud, of course, thinks in some kind of weird ways that early experience with parental figures influences your subsequent personality. They didn't buy the details, but they thought there's something to that the relationships you have with people early in life inform what you expect out of relationships later in life. So that's the idea of the internal working model. So for example, if your parents are responsive when you're young, you form the internal working model that I can trust people, I can get close to people, etc. There's something that seems right about that, although I'll note, just to be annoying, twin studies indicate that attachment style also significantly heritable. So, but probably something to this. Okay, any questions? Let's take our break. Let's come back at 5:05. All right, let's finish the chapter. So the next section is on moral development. I will choose to control myself because this is close to my own area of research. So I'll keep it brief, but I'll just start with a distinction that may help you stay clear about what's being researched here, and that's the distinction between moral philosophy and moral psychology. So moral philosophy is about conceptual questions related to morality. So a moral philosopher might ask, what do we mean by terms like right or wrong? Or what are the right answers to moral questions? Indeed, are there right answers to moral questions? Debates like that would fall under the purview of moral philosophy. Whereas psychologists are not interested in questions like that, at least not when they're doing their research. We answer empirical questions about morality. In particular, facts having to do with how people make moral judgments. Things like what's going on in their brain when they make moral judgments, or what are the kinds of patterns that exist in moral judgment. But we don't care about what the right answer is to those moral questions. So, as an example, there's a big body of research looking at how people respond to trolley-like dilemmas. So, how many of you know like trolley dilemmas? So these are cases where, should you push the large man in front of the trolley to save 5? Or should you pull a switch to redirect a trolley so it's going to hit 5? Should you pull a switch to redirect it to hit 1? So I won't get into too many details. This is mostly an excuse to show another funny video. So one professor decided to give this dilemma to his 2 young children. One was a boy, one was a girl, and they answered differently. The difference is kind of interesting. Okay, so that's a small sample size. Obviously, you got to replicate it, but anyways. So the only point I'm making here is that what the right answer is to something like the trolley problem is not something that psychologists are interested in. We're interested in again, patterns in how people make moral judgments, not what the right answers are. An early important researcher in this area is Lawrence Kohlberg. And he's in this chapter because he looked at how moral judgments change over time. So he got a sample of kids and looked at how they answered moral dilemmas at different ages. It's worth noting, everyone in his sample was a little boy. One critic of Kohlberg's pointed this out later, but so he got his sample, and he gave them various dilemmas. One famous example is called the Heinz dilemma. So you're supposed to imagine there's a guy named Heinz, his wife is dying of a disease, and he can't afford the medication, so the only way for him to get the medication is to break into the pharmacy and steal the medication to save his wife's life. Is that right or wrong, and why? And the key thing for defining which stage the kids are at is not which answer they give to any given dilemma, it's the types of justifications they give, the types of reasons they give when defending their moral judgments. And Kohlberg found that kids pretty reliably fall into 3 stages: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Again, when you're memorizing it, just focus on the fact that conventional is in the middle, right? Pre and post, obviously before and after. So, I should say, conventional means having to do with social conventions. So the middle stage that you should orient yourself around means you think of morality in terms of what other people think, or in terms of what society at large thinks. I'll say more about that in a second, but that's the middle one. Pre-conventional morality, which typically is 9 and under, although Piaget found variability there, but generally speaking around that age. At this stage, kids think about morality in terms of how actions affect them. So if I do something and I get a reward, good action. If I do something and I get punished, bad action. So it's very, very selfish way of thinking about morality. For conventional, as I already said, it's about what other people think. So what do my peers think is right or wrong? Or as you get more advanced in that stage, what does society at large or the law say is right or wrong? So morality is just a matter of convention. When you hit the post-conventional stage, you start to think that actually other people or even society at large can be wrong. So at this stage, kids start, or not kids, so this one is usually like 16, 17 and up. Kids think in terms of, or people think in terms of abstract moral principles. And if societal practices go against those principles, so much the worse for those societal practices. So, classic example, think of someone like Martin Luther King, right, civil rights activist. So, the societal norm at the time is that segregation and racism are good. Those are inscribed in law, inscribed in social practice, but based on principles like justice or fairness, those practices are bad. So when you're in the post-conventional stage, you're willing to go against societal norms. Based on values and principles like human rights, equality, etc. So nothing too fancy there. That's Kohlberg's model. Actually, each stage further subdivides into two, but I won't add that. That's maybe more advanced. I'll mention in passing two critics of Kohlberg. One is Carol Gilligan, who, as I already said, pointed out that Kohlberg only looked at boys, and it turns out that half the population is not boys. So Gilligan said, well, we should look to see if the same patterns exist in girls as they develop. And she argued that girls were less likely at the end of development to think about morality in terms of principles and more likely to think about it in terms of relationships or context. Now, some subsequent work has failed to replicate that, so there's a bit of a question mark there. Some moral psychologists think there really isn't much difference in terms of how boys and girls develop morally, but either way, it's still obviously a good point to say, hey, you should replicate this with a representative sample. Another critique that the book also mentions is that this may reflect a Western bias. So in this conception, the pinnacle of moral development is being willing to go against cultural norms, right? That's what post-conventional morality is about. And that may ring more true in individualistic societies where, uniqueness and a willingness to go against the expectations of your group is more important. But in a collectivistic society, that may not be the final stage, because in collectivistic cultures, conformity is emphasized more. So you don't have to decide what you think about this, but that is a criticism that has been leveled against Kohlberg. Any questions about Dr. Kohlberg? Okay. Next section is on adolescence. So there's less here than there is about kids, but so adolescence begins at puberty. There are various neuronal changes that occur at this place. At this time, there's a continuation of growing connections and pruning connections. This finishes, or takes the longest to finish in the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes take the longest to develop, and this could be because when you're a teen, you're still kind of learning the norms of your culture or community, and we've always been a social species, so it's important to stay flexible for a longer period of time. Two bioterms that you have to know, many of you will probably already know, are primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics. Primary means those having directly to do with reproduction. So basically the genitals and the related plumbing. That's the primary sex characteristics. Any sex differences that are not directly related to reproduction are classified as secondary sex characteristics. So even like wider hips and breasts in women technically are classified as secondary. Things like facial hair or bigger muscles in males, also secondary sex characteristics. Okay, next there's a section on sexual orientation. So I sort of mentioned in passing back in the evolutionary psych chapter that our discussion there was primarily about heterosexual attraction. But there is interesting work in both biology and evolutionary psychology on possible causes of differences in sexual orientation. So to start with, if you use the standard twin study methods, homosexuality, like basically every human trait, is partly heritable. So identical twins are more similar in terms of sexual orientation than non-identical twins. I'll come back to that in a second. There's also some work, and that's a pretty consistent finding. Now, there was some early work trying to see if there was a hormonal component to this. One thing that is going to sound made up, but you can look it up later, this is a real thing. There's a correlation between how much testosterone a fetus is exposed to in the womb and how much longer the ring finger is compared to the pointer finger. And as soon as I say this, half the class right away looks at their hands. So on average, females have pointer and ring fingers that are more equal in length, and males tend to have longer ring fingers. And within males and females, there is a correlation. Now, don't freak out too much about your particular thing. It's only like on average, but if you get a big sample, you'll find this correlation. So an obvious thing to test is, do gay men, for example, have hormone profiles that are more similar to straight women? And there, the results are kind of a mess. There's not a consistent pattern there, but it is something that's been looked into. One quite reliable difference is that, and the book mentions this, is that men and women seem to differ in terms of how much erotic plasticity they have, or erotic flexibility. So men are on average more likely to be either gay or straight. Obviously there are some bisexual men, but men are more likely to be either one or the other. Whereas women, even women who identify as straight, are more likely to be able to be aroused by both. So you can do those kind of creepy studies where you show people things and measure physiological arousal. And men are more likely to basically only get aroused by what they say they like, but women on average are more likely to be aroused by both. Now, given that homosexual attraction has at least a partial genetic basis, this leads to a kind of evolutionary puzzle. How is it that such genes would get passed on? And there are a couple of hypotheses that you should write down beside the key term. So there's the key term evolutionary hypotheses about homosexual attraction. They have fancier names, but these are easier to remember. One, and this is a term that's used in the literature, is the gay uncle theory. Sounds kind of funny. But the idea here is rooted in a process we talked about back in the evolutionary psych chapter, which is kin selection. So, kin selection is the idea that traits which predispose you to help out your family can increase in frequency. So, a tendency to love your kids or love your siblings or your cousins, given that they share some of your genes, those traits can get passed on. And so one early idea was maybe genes which predispose men to be gay also predispose them to help out more with their, say, nieces and nephews. And over time, theoretically, you can get genes for homosexuality passed on in that way. So, as I say, theoretically possible. The issue is, at least in Western samples, the prediction that this theory makes doesn't come true. So the prediction that you'd make on the basis of this theory is that gay men would be more likely to invest in nieces and nephews than straight men. Like, in order for it to work, that's what would have to happen. And that prediction seems to not be confirmed. Now, there are some studies in more traditional societies that may be consistent with this. So this one a bit up in the air. The other one, which has some better support, including actually a specific gene that's been identified, is what I'm going to call the female relatives theory. This has a fancier name in the literature, but don't worry about that. The idea here has to do with the X chromosome. And in fact, there's a specific one that's been identified, XQ2A. And this is not the gay gene. As with everything in psychology, it's almost never a single gene. But this is one gene that explains some of the variants, at least in some studies. The idea here is genes on the X chromosome that predispose you to being attracted to men. If those genes are on the X chromosome, they are twice as likely to wind up in the body of a female than the body of a male. And so from the gene's eye view, the gene can still, get spread that way. It just has this side effect that when it lands in the body of a male, it statistically increases its chances of being gay. But when it lands in a woman, it will make her have more kids on average. There's some support for this from a study of Samoa. So in Samoa, they have a term called fa'afafine, which if you translate it literally means in the manner of a woman. So this is sort of their term for gay men. The female relatives of fa'afafine, on average, have more kids. So consistent with this idea. I'll mention in passing too, because then you might ask, well, what about female homosexuality? And here, this one won't be on the test, but just if you're curious, I don't want to seem like I'm leaving anyone out, the evolutionary conjecture that's been put forward is that, one way of saying it is, a female-female pair has everything you need to raise a kid. All they lack is a single cell. And those cells are very easy to get. And so the idea is that female-female attraction may be a kind of backup strategy. If there's no males around, or if the male leaves, you can still pair bond with a woman and then raise the kid. These are all, of course, somewhat speculative, but those are some theories that have been put forward. One last one I'll say, and this one's quite speculative, but I have one anecdote that's consistent with this. This is put forward by Daryl Bem. Is exotic becomes erotic. Daryl Bem's kind of a mad genius. I mean that in a good and bad way. The idea here, and this one definitely won't be on the test, but the idea is whichever sex you grow up thinking is more weird, that's the one you become attracted to. So if you grow up thinking, if you're a boy and you think, well, I don't get girls, they're so weird, then that's who you become attracted to. Conversely, if you grow up thinking, I don't get boys, they're so different, then you're more likely to grow up to be gay. I mention this in part just because I mentioned this to my gay friend, and when I explained it to him, he said, that makes perfect sense. When I was in elementary school, I couldn't even accept that males were in the same species as me. So, one small, but anecdotes don't prove anything. That's more just a funny theory. Okay. Next theory comes from someone named Erik Erikson. So Erikson is what we call a neo-Freudian. So he took some ideas from Freud's theory of development, which have to do with moms and a bunch of other weird stuff, and kind of de-sexified it and made it more plausible. But I would like to apologize about this theory. So the theory has 8 stages, and each one has 2 possible pathways, a good pathway and a bad pathway. Oh, and these are also testable, nudge, nudge, hint, hint. Here's the annoying part. So 8 stages, 2 pathways, so 16 terms total. Of those 16, 7 of them begin with the letter I. very frustrating, but it's not my fault, it's Erikson's fault. So the first one lasts from 0 to about 2, or maybe a little less. And this one is trust versus mistrust. So the key developmental variable here is breastfeeding. And the question for Erikson is, how responsive is the mother to the kid's needs? What the kid is trying to figure out is, will the world be responsive to my needs or not? So if you learn that yes, the world will be responsive to my needs, then you go down the trust pathway. If not, you go down the mistrust pathway. The next stage, about 2 to 3, is toilet training. That's the key event. So the conflict or crisis is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy means like being self-controlled and independent. So do you successfully learn how to control yourself and get potty trained? Or do you fail to do that and feel embarrassed about it? So that would be the shame and doubt pathway. The next one, 3 to 6, is initiative versus guilt. So kids starts to be able to do things on their own to some extent. Are they able to be curious and explore the environment, or do they get punished for curiosity and therefore feel guilty? So they go down the path of not being willing to take initiative, be curious. Next one is 6 to 12. This one has 2 I's, so that's really frustrating. Industry versus inferiority. So the key thing here is going to school, maybe playing sports, stuff like that. And basically, can you get good at stuff? Right? So if you can get good at stuff, then you go down the industry path. You're able to do well in school or sports or different things like that. If not, you develop an inferiority complex. Yes?
I've also heard it as competence versus inferiority.
That would have been better, yeah. All the books I've seen say industry. Maybe they were trying to soften the blow of the 7 I's. I'm pretty sure Erikson said industry, but maybe he got it from his parents. Obviously his parents aren't very creative. Their last name was Erikson, they named him Erik, so. Not a wordsmith. Next one, 12 to 18, and we'll actually zoom in on this one in the next section and build on it a bit, but identity versus role confusion. So the question here is developing a social identity. Can you figure out who you are in relation to other people? So in school, for example, are you going to be the band kid, the jock, the cool kid, whatever? Like what group are you going to be a part of? What's your social identity? Kids also, during this stage, begin to ask questions like, what are my political or religious beliefs? My parents may have certain ones, but do I want to go along with those, or do I want to kind of forge my own sense? So if you successfully develop a social identity, obviously that's the identity path. If not, role confusion. I've seen different numbers for the next one, which also has 2 I's. The book says 19 to 40. I've seen some that are more like 19 to 30. Whatever, young adulthood, roughly speaking. Intimacy versus isolation. So you start to get on the dating market more seriously maybe than you did in high school. Are you able to develop a long-term relationship or not? So pretty self-explanatory, intimacy versus isolation. After that, the book says 40 to 65. generativity versus stagnation. Generativity would involve being a productive member of society. So, having kids, having a job, being a productive member of the community. If by contrast you're still in your mom's basement, maybe because it's too expensive in Vancouver, whatever the reason, you don't achieve that, then you're in the stagnation path. And then the last one, 65 to death, integrity versus despair. So you're done with your productive work and child-rearing years, and you're reflecting back on your life. Are you proud of what you've accomplished? Do you have a sense that, I'm sad that my life's almost over, but, I feel proud of what I achieved. I've left a legacy and was productive. Or do you think, I never really amounted to anything, and now my life is almost over, which would be the despair path. Okay, so apologies for the possible memory mix-ups, but any questions about Erikson? Okay, as I say, we'll zoom in on one of them, the identity versus role confusion one. Future work has built on this and come up with 4 kind of sub-stages of the identity versus role confusion. And those 4 are identity diffusion, identity foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. So identity diffusion, and the empirical work shows that kids, reach these at different ages, but identity diffusion is the I don't give a shit stage. Someone asks, who are you? What's your identity? I don't care, bro. No effort given to figuring out who you are. Foreclosure is, you start to appreciate that, no, you do have to figure out who you are, or what your social identity will be, but you just default to your parents' values or expectations. So whatever your parents want you to be, or whatever their values are, that's what you just go along with. So foreclosure, because you're kind of putting off the difficult work of forging your own identity. Moratorium, or you could call this one crisis, is when you realize that won't do, that your parents' expectations aren't working for you, and so this is where the hard work is done, of, okay, actually, who am I and what do I care about? And if you go through that successfully, kind of self-explanatory, you hit achievement, identity achievement, so that's successfully forging a sense of who you are. Any questions on these? And then one more term related to adolescence, adolescent egocentrism. Now, I think I warned earlier that it would mean something different in this context. So back in Piaget, egocentrism meant an inability to understand that other people have different minds than you do. Here, this is a couple of things, but the core of it is you think that you are very, very special. When you're an adolescent, and you're in love, for example, you think, no one's been in love like this before. And relatedly, you think that because you're so special, everyone is always looking at you, which makes adolescence very stressful. You're constantly worried about being judged for deviating from the norms of your peers, and so you think there's a spotlight on you. You know, you're very important and everyone's always looking at you. This may serve a function, you know, as I say, when we're teens, we're trying to learn the norms of our peers, and having this kind of obsessive thought that everyone's looking at you may motivate you to learn them. But I have very good news for you all, that you will all start to realize, you're all probably towards the end of this, the great relief of adulthood is the realization that no one gives a shit about you. So you can just calm down. That may sound bad, but it's actually very comforting. It's okay. You can just relax. Okay, next, there's a section on parenting, so different parenting styles. The key figure here is Diana Baumrind. Pretty simple model. There are two variables, each of which you can be high or low in. Love can be high or low. You'll see different terms in the literature, but basically that's what it means. And strictness can also be high or low. So the annoying part is the two highly strict ones. They have similar names. High in strictness but low in love is called authoritarian. So authoritarian is, you know, do this. Why? Because I said so. Slap. So like in politics, authoritarian is a political term, right? It means like a dictator, dictatorial type of leader. High in both, so high in strictness and high in love, is called authoritative. Baumrind should have made a different word, but too bad, that's the one that she used. Make sure you're able to distinguish these. Nudge, nudge, hint, hint. So authoritative parents set clear rules, but they are willing to explain the reasons for the rules. Yes?
So I heard there's like a way to memorize it. Is that authoritative at the end? It's IVE, like give. So, like,
Oh,
give
that's good.
explanations.
Oh, I like that. Okay, there you go. So I did it just by remembering authoritarian sounds like a dictator, and that's bad. Okay, give. You give explanations. Very good. Okay, so if that helps, you can use that as well. So yeah, as I say, they're willing to explain the reasons for the rules, and of all the styles, this is the one that's associated with the best outcomes in the kids. Now, that's only correlational. Correlation isn't causation, but if you take the correlation at face value, that's what you get. Permissive is high in love but low in strictness. So sort of like hippie parents, you know, we love you, we're always here for you, but do whatever the hell you want. There's a technical term for kids with parents like this. The technical term is little shits. I'll let that part out. And the worst one, that's kind of the worst of both worlds, is neglectful. So parents who are not nice, do not show love, and do not set clear guidelines. So really not much parenting going on there. That's the fourth and worst one. Good. So parenting, obviously something you do, well, I shouldn't say obviously, you usually do in adulthood. There's then a section on cognitive changes that happen during adulthood. So we didn't talk about IQ in this chapter, but intelligence researchers distinguish between what they call fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is roughly how nimble and agile is your brain. how good are you at solving new problems? So this would relate to things like mental speed and problem-solving ability. Whereas crystallized is basically how much stuff do you know? Things like vocabulary, general knowledge would fall under crystallized. And what you find is, I have some bad news for you all. Fluid intelligence peaks in the mid-20s, give or take. So in the mid-20s, your brain is as fast as it will be. After that, it starts to go down. So here's what that looks like. So you can see that both fluid intelligence and mental speed start to go down following the mid-20s. Whereas crystallized intelligence, so like how much stuff you know, stays the same or even goes up a bit after the mid-20s. So that kind of makes sense, right? Just as your body is less slow, is more slow as you grow up, your brain is too. But you can accumulate more general knowledge about the world. The history of science is consistent with this. If you look at great scientists who make like big discoveries, very often they make them in their mid-20s. So, for example, Isaac Newton, a lot of his big discoveries like law of gravitation and others were made in his 20s. He invented calculus when he was 24. Took him a few months, which makes me feel like a profound failure. But Einstein was similar. Okay, just a few more things. What about marriage? So, a significant percentage of people get married. This is the eternal question. Is this good for people? Are married happy? Are married people more or less happy? This is my evening class. I taught in the morning, so give me some grace. But are married people more or less happy? One opinion I will show is from the great philosopher Kramer from Seinfeld. So even though that was very colorfully put, the book notes, and this is well replicated, in fact, married people are on average healthier, happier, and live longer, as it turns out. But satisfaction with the relationship, and actually with life in general, follows a U-curve. So both life satisfaction and marriage satisfaction quite reliably, and cross-culturally for that matter, exist on a curve. So enjoy your 20s while they last. This is one of the good times in life. So people are happy then, you're trying new things, experiencing life. And if you get married, there's like the honeymoon phase. So again, happiness peaks. Then, the boring job sets in, you have a couple kids, and life becomes more difficult, and self-reported happiness goes down. But then, funny enough, old age, for whatever reason, is also a very happy time in life. In fact, often even higher than the 20s. I think there's a key term about this. That's what's meant by the U-curve. And then the last concept for the course is the 5 stages of grief. This is developed by a couple of psychiatrists. So it was originally developed in the context of people who were dying, so people who had a disease and knew they were dying. It's later been applied to other forms of grief and loss as well. And I should say this is somewhat controversial, but it's an influential account and worth knowing about. So the 5 stages are denial. So you find out you're dying. Denial is what it sounds like. You refuse to accept the bad news. Anger, again, pretty self-explanatory. You're indignant about the unfairness that this is happening to you. bargaining. So this is when you try to negotiate or cheat your way out of the bad fate. So if you're religious, maybe you pray, God, if you get me out of this, I will read the Bible every day, or something like that. You can imagine secular versions of that too, but that's what's meant by bargaining. And then depression, where the fate sets in. And the last stage, acceptance, which again is what it sounds like. You are at peace with the bad fate. So, to seal those in, last clip of the semester, I have a clip from Robot Chicken. Okay, that's Psych 1100. Any questions? See you all next week for the lab.